him to obey God because he had been obedient and he had been virtuous and he had been devout and he had been kicked all over the place like an ill-treated dog. Job demands that he be able to appear before God and maintain his utter and complete integrity. Well, at the end of the drama, God does appear as Job had requested, speaking to him out of the whirlwind. God grants to Job a vision of his great creative power, of his infinite purposes. Now, God doesn't answer Job by explaining everything. The mystery of God's dealings with men are still ultimately incomprehensible. But Job is comforted by the presence of God. For God's presence indicates that he is still concerned about his creation, in spite of the presence of evil and suffering. Job repents of his impatience and trusts in God even where he cannot understand. Job learns to face life in the faith that he is still in the hands of one who knows and cares. In the modern drama, J.B., we have a similarly good man. This time he is a typical man of our modern world, a prosperous banker, who first enjoys amazing prosperity, which he knows that he has not deserved, and who later suffers equally undeserved adversity. Now, the tortures that J.B. and his wife Sarah endure are dramatically portrayed. Their children are all killed in various ways. His bank is destroyed in a bombing. He suffers a painful disease, and he is left at the mercy of 3 inadequate comforters, representing roughly communism, psychiatry, and traditional religion. J.B. too demands a reason for his suffering from God. Like Job, he is not given a reason. However, he does resist the suggestion of the devil that he commit suicide. Like the forsythia bush that insists upon blooming in the ruins of their bombed-out city, he and Sarah discover that they have no choice but to go on living in spite of their undeserved and inexplicable tragedy. The thing that makes life possible for J.B. is the human love that he and Sarah have for one another. God does not love. He is, says J.B. But we do, answers Sarah. It's all the light now. Blow on the coal of the heart. The candles in the churches are out. The lights have gone out in the sky. Blow on the coal of the heart, and we'll see by and by. The coal of the heart, that is human love, is all that is left to J.B. in an unintelligible world, ruled by a blind power that you may, if you wish, call God. But this God is a God who does not know, who does not love, and who does not care. For the vision of a living and caring God which is given to Job, and faith which Job has in this God, Mr. McLeish has substituted faith in man's own ability to make a pool of love in the midst of the injustice of an incomprehensible world. God has been reduced to a voice over the public address system and an unthinking tyrant who must be forgiven, if indeed he exists at all. J.B., goaded by the insane fury of life in an atomic war, finally accepts suffering as inevitable and inexplicable. All that is left on the positive side is a grim determination to carry on. He sums up what he has learned as follows: we are, and what we are can suffer. But what suffers, loves, and love will live its suffering again. J.B. finds his power to go on in his love for man, while Job finds it in his faith in God. Keeping in mind what we have said of J.B. and Job, let us go to the person of Jesus. The parallels between the experience of Jesus and that of Job and J.B. are many. In the story of the Gospels, we find an innocent man, completely blameless and loved by God. And yet he suffers without cause as far as we can see. But further, we find indications in the Gospels that Jesus is tempted to yield to a despair of the most drastic nature. It appears that suffering was just as great a mystery to him as it is to us. In the midst of his pain and suffering, he was compelled to drink the cup of disappointment and abandonment. We recall his words in the Garden of Gethsemane, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me." We recall his words from the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" There is nothing that he did not share with Job or J.B. or with us all. He didn't know the why of it all either, and he doesn't explain it to us. But he does show us how to face it in essentially two ways. The way of J.B. first, that is, the way of love to others, the way of reconciliation with one's neighbor. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. But also the way of Job, the way of faith and trust in God in the face of incomprehensible adversity. Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. But the person of Jesus Christ, his life and his death, can say something very important to us that is said by neither J.B. nor Job. First, he gives new meaning and understanding to the justice of God. Somehow, when we think of God, we are like J.B. and Job. We think that God is love, and that this means that God's justice will always work out in our favor. In the light of the suffering and death of Jesus, we are forced to see that the truth concerning the justice of God is not quite so comfortable. In his satire, The Great Divorce, C.S. Lewis takes us with a busload of inhabitants of hell, they're called ghosts, who have made an excursion from hell to heaven with a view to remaining there permanently. There they meet the citizens of heaven, referred to as solid people. One very big ghost is astonished to meet a solid person who on earth was tried and executed for murder. "What I'd like to understand," he explodes, "is what you're here for, as pleased as Punch, you a murderer, while I've been walking around in the streets down there and living in a pigsty all these years." The solid person tries to explain that he has been forgiven and that he and the man he has murdered have been reunited before the judgment seat of God. But the big ghost is having none of this. The injustice of the situation staggers him. My rights, he keeps shouting. "I've got my rights the same as you, see?" "Oh no," the solid person assures him. "It's not as bad as all that. I haven't got any rights, or I wouldn't be here. You will not get your rights either. You will get something far better than what you deserve." But Nothing placates the big ghost who angrily protests that he is not looking for mercy, but for justice. He stupidly doesn't realize that justice is exactly what he has received. If we really want to establish the truth of God's justice, then we had better recognize that God is greater than our sentimental popular Christianity commonly suggests. Our trouble is that we look for God only in the lovely, desirable, beautiful aspects of life. And seeing about us nothing but confusion and ugliness, we conclude, like J.B., that there cannot be a God, or else that he is unjust. We place ourselves in the front and center of this universe and sort of look on God as a cosmic nursemaid who exists only to make us comfortable. We forget that all of life comes under the sovereignty of God, even the dark and depressing things, and that through these, if we listen carefully enough, the voice of God may be heard. The biblical writers, were realists. They found the presence of God. They heard his voice speaking not only in the sunshine, but also in the storm. Not only in the flower, but also in the earthquake. Not only in victory, but also in defeat. They saw their relationship with God not only in terms of comfort, but also in terms of power. And it was never their fear that God would deal unjustly with them, but rather that he would be altogether too just. Why doesn't God do something? The answer may well be that through allowing these tragedies to occur, God is judging us for our failure to respond to what he has already done. God has placed a world in our hands. He has filled it with many good things. At one very definite point in history, God took the ultimate step. He divested himself of his heavenly glory. He came where we are. And he took all the suffering that is common to us upon himself. In this act, he has suffered in order that our suffering and the evil present in the world that is ultimately responsible for this suffering will be overcome. This God has done for us. And if we think rightly, we should not question God's justice anymore. We should stop and thank God that he has not dealt with us more justly for defiling the world that he has given us and for betraying and rejecting his love which came in the person of his only begotten Son. Secondly, goodness finds its reward not in some materialistic favor, but in the giving of God himself. There's something worse in life than having to suffer innocently, and that is the feeling that you have to suffer alone. Imagine a child lying desperately ill in some room, lonely, unloved, and uncared for. Now imagine the same scene, only with a mother present. Bending over the child, entering into its suffering, surrounding it with an atmosphere of love. Now there's no less pain, there's no less poverty, yet the presence of the mother's love makes the whole grim situation so infinitely more tolerable. No, the worst thing about atheism and agnosticism is not that it leads to evil or to badness, but that it leads to an incurable loneliness. To renounce our faith does not improve the situation. It only makes it worse. It only leaves us to our frail human resources at the mercy of a vast, unconscious, immoral machine. The Christian man may not suffer less for being a Christian, but he doesn't suffer alone. Beside him is one who knows what he is going through in a most intimate way, and surrounds him with an atmosphere of love. Whereas Job sees God's presence as something distant and removed, hidden in the power of the whirlwind, whereas J.B. sees no trace of his presence whatsoever in the horrors of the atomic war, candles in the churches are out, the gospel sees his presence unmistakably in the one who hangs on the cross. There is God's own Son who shares our suffering, who enters into it with us completely. The cross stands not for the blind acceptance of suffering, but rather for the transformation of life, which even in its darkest and deepest and most bewildering moments can be filled with the presence of a loving and caring God. The roar of the whirlwind and the distant voice on the PA system have become a person who gives up his life for you and for me. The Christian man may be no less helpless for being a Christian, but at least he is not helpless in a vacuum. He has a source of stability, a strength that undergirds him, something greater than himself to which he can cling. There is something worse in life than confusion on the world scene, and that is that we should have no idea of how to live in the midst of this confusion. The Christian man may have no less confusion around him for being a Christian, but at least his life moves with a sense of purpose, and he feels himself impelled in the direction of goals that are worthwhile. There is something worse in life than the darkness of doubt and despair, and that is that we should be unable to see beyond the darkness. The Christian man will not have an easier life for being a Christian. A more difficult life, perhaps, because Christianity brings him into closer touch with reality. But it will never be a life of unrelieved despair, because he lives it in the eternal perspective, and because through the darkness of the journey he can see the light of home. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost.